Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Poirot's Hidden Secrets Exposed, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Hercule Poirot. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Silent Witness. The rain poured heavily against the windows, casting shadows on the ancient walls of the manor. The clock struck midnight with a solemn chime, its echoes reverberating through the darkened halls, each tick a reminder of time slipping away. It was in this foreboding silence that the tragedy unfolded. There in the parlor, a man lay lifeless on the floor, his body sprawled in an unnatural position. His eyes, wide open, stared at the ceiling with an expression of horror frozen in place. A pool of blood spread slowly beneath him, dark and still. The only other sound in the room was the soft, rhythmic flicker of the candles, their flames trembling in the draughts that whispered through the cracks in the walls. But what was that? A movement in the corner of the room, a shadow, fleeting yet distinct, a brief flicker in the dim light, unnoticed by all but one. Hercule Poirot, ever the observer, stood still in the doorway, his sharp eyes flicking from the body to the surroundings. The room was silent once more, but Poirot could feel the subtle, mounting tension in the air. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and it was something he could feel, not yet see, something hidden just beneath the surface. "Mon Dieu," Inspector Japp exclaimed, his face pale as he stood over the victim. "What in the world happened here, Poirot?" Poirot stepped into the room with an elegant calmness, his perfectly tailored suit untouched by the grime of the storm outside. His mustache twitched slightly, a signature motion when his mind began to work. He took a long look at the body, his eyes narrowing as he took in the fine details. His gaze, unblinking, scanned the surroundings, each book on the shelf, every crumpled piece of paper on the floor, the arrangement of furniture in the room. It was as though he were collecting pieces of a puzzle no one else could see. "Ah, mon ami," Poirot said softly, his voice like velvet but carrying an unspoken authority, "the answer to this mystery lies not in what is seen, but in what is not. A clue, a silent witness, is present, though it speaks only to those who know how to listen." Inspector Japp, who had seen his fair share of deaths, furrowed his brow. A clue? Where? Poirot's eyes lingered on the victim's outstretched hand, the way his fingers clutched something tightly in death. Slowly, Poirot approached, bending down to gently examine the corpse. His fingers hovered near the lifeless hand, and with a deliberate motion, he pried the fingers open. In the victim's palm, nestled as though carefully placed, was a single, blood-stained slip of paper. "Mon Dieu," Japp muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "What does it mean?" Poirot lifted the paper with the grace of a surgeon, examining it with careful scrutiny. The writing was small, almost microscopic, but it was unmistakable. "She knows." The words were scrawled hastily, the ink smeared, as though the writer had been under duress. Poirot's eyes flicked back to the body, his mind already assembling a theory, but he kept his thoughts to himself for now. The storm outside howled louder, as if mirroring the storm brewing in the detective's mind. A brief silence followed, before Poirot stood up, his eyes flicking over the room once more, assessing the atmosphere, the shadows. He turned to Jap, his gaze sharp. This is no random murder. This was carefully orchestrated. A deliberate act meant to send a message. But to whom? And why? Jap looked baffled. You're telling me the killer left a message? Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes not leaving the room. Yes, but not in the way you think. The message is not for us. It is for the one who will find it. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the few other occupants who had remained behind, drawn in by the commotion. They stood by the windows, the tension in the room thickening with each passing second. But let us not rush to conclusions. There is much to be learned. Poirot walked over to a chair, which had been tipped over in the chaos, and righted it with precision. His eyes flicked to the various people in the room, lingering on each face, as though he were reading their every thought, their every lie. The storm outside grew louder, a perfect accompaniment to the tension in the air. Who found the body? Poirot asked, his voice carrying an almost imperceptible edge. A woman stepped forward, her expression pale but composed. She was well dressed, her appearance elegant, but with a distinct air of nervousness. I did, she said, her voice steady, but not without a quiver. I was coming to check on Mr. Radford. He had been acting strangely all evening. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He observed her carefully, her posture, her demeanor, the slight tremor in her hand as she spoke. Her name was Miss Elizabeth Hawthorne, a woman with a reputation for both intelligence and ambition, though she had long been the subject of rumors among the town's elite. She was known for her sharp wit, and her beauty had captivated many men. But was she as innocent as she appeared? And what was it, mademoiselle, Poirot asked softly, that caused you to check on Mr. Radford this evening? Surely you must have had some forewarning. Elizabeth's eyes shifted briefly, a flicker of something hidden behind her calm facade. She hesitated, then seemed to recover herself. He had been acting. Strangely, as I said, he was on edge, pacing about, muttering to himself. I thought perhaps he was ill. Poirot nodded, his eyes never leaving her. A man pacing. And what did he say? Did you hear him speak? Elizabeth's gaze flicked toward the door nervously. No, I didn't hear clearly. Just words I couldn't understand. He was speaking to himself. Poirot raised an eyebrow, considering her response. So you did not hear anything that might explain why Mr. Radford would write such a note? He gestured to the blood-stained paper. A note, you see, that clearly implies someone knows something. Elizabeth's lips pressed tightly together. I don't know anything about that, she said, her voice quivering. She seemed to be losing control, her poised exterior cracking ever so slightly. Poirot turned his attention to the others in the room, noting their behavior, their body language. There was Michael Radford's estranged son, Victor Radford, standing near the window, his back turned. He looked as though he were trying to avoid drawing attention to himself, but Poirot's sharp eyes could not be fooled. Ah, Victor, my good friend, Poirot said with a slight smile, his tone silky but cutting. You seem troubled. Troubled, yes? Why is that, I wonder? Victor stiffened, turning slowly to face the detective. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, but there was something in his expression, a flicker of guilt that Poirot did not miss. I am not troubled, Poirot. Victor stammered. I'm just shocked, that's all. Poirot's eyes locked onto Victor's with quiet intensity. Shock, mon ami, is an emotion that one might expect when the unexpected occurs. But there is something more. You see, my friend, your fear is not the kind one has when witnessing a tragic event. It is the kind one experiences when one is being hunted. Poirot's voice dropped, his words like a blade. You fear the truth coming to light? Yes? Victor's eyes widened, and his lips pressed into a tight line. He said nothing, but the silence spoke volumes. Poirot turned to Jap, his expression unreadable. There is more to this, Jap. Much more. The truth, mon ami, lies not only in the bodies we examine, but in the shadows that hide beneath the surface. The investigation had begun, and Poirot, ever calm, was already steps ahead. Chapter 2. The Disappearing Act. The storm outside had not let up. If anything, it had worsened. The howling wind scraped the windows, while torrents of rain battered the manor's ancient stone walls. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The gas lamps cast flickering shadows along the hallway, their light weak against the oppressive darkness of the night. There was a stillness to the house, unnerving and absolute. But it was the disappearance of Elizabeth Hawthorne that had shaken them all. One moment, she was in the parlor, speaking with Poirot and the others. The next, she was gone, vanished into thin air. Poirot's mind had already begun its work. He stood in the center of the room, his back straight, hands behind him as he surveyed the scene. He had seen many disappearances in his time, but this one was different. The eerie silence of the house seemed to deepen around him, urging him to make sense of it. Elizabeth Hawthorne had simply disappeared. No signs of struggle, no trace of where she might have gone. The room had not changed, save for the absence of the woman herself. Jap's voice broke the stillness, an edge of panic in his tone. She couldn't have just vanished. Someone must have seen something. Poirot's gaze, sharp as ever, turned slowly toward the inspector. He raised one hand, a calming gesture, and said softly, "Ah, Jap, human nature, it never changes. People look, but they do not always see." Jap fidgeted, clearly agitated. "What are you getting at, Poirot? We've searched the entire house. There's no trace of her. Not a sound, not a sign." Poirot's eyes flicked toward the window, where the rain beat against the glass, the darkness outside swallowing the world whole. "You see, my friend, the world does not work in such simple terms. People vanish, yes, but rarely without leaving something behind. Even the most careful of criminals must leave a clue, a whisper, a hint, something that reveals their presence." He took a few steps, his eyes never leaving the space where Elizabeth had stood. Poirot's mind was already racing. He scanned the room again, his gaze sweeping over the walls, the floor, the furnishings. His methodical nature was already at work. Then, as if finding something hidden in plain sight, he moved quickly to the small desk in the corner of the room. It was a simple, polished piece of furniture, but there, beneath a stack of letters, was a single, torn page of a journal. It had been hastily shoved aside. Poirot's fingers hovered over the page, his sharp eyes scanning the scrawled words. "I cannot stay. He will know. They will all know if I do not act now." The message, a frantic note, barely legible, spoke volumes to the detective. Elizabeth had been in a rush, trying to leave something behind. A warning, perhaps. But to whom? And why? "Poirot, what did you find?" Jap asked, his voice thick with growing uncertainty. Poirot lifted the note, turning it slowly in his hands. His face, always composed, tightened slightly as he read the words aloud. "It seems Mademoiselle Hawthorne was aware of something she could not afford to let others discover. A secret, perhaps, or a threat. But this note, it is only a piece of the puzzle. We must find more. His mind was already at work, piecing together the fragments of this mystery. Elizabeth Hawthorne had vanished without a trace, and yet she had left a trail, however faint, for Poirot to follow. But it was not just the woman's disappearance that troubled him. It was the absence of any signs of her departure, any hint of her movements. No doors had been opened, no windows breached. The only other option left was that she had vanished by means far more calculated than anyone had realized. The storm outside raged louder, the sound of it filling the air like a living thing. Poirot's gaze flicked to the window again, his thoughts turning inward. Recalled the details from the night before. The party, the guests, the subtle tensions in the air. But one face had remained fixed in his memory. Victor Radford, the estranged son of the murdered man, Michael Radford. Victor's behavior had been strange the night before. His nervous glances, his discomfort when the conversation turned to his family's fortune. There was something more beneath the surface, something Poirot couldn't yet put his finger on. Poirot turned toward Japp, his voice cutting through the storm. "We must speak to Victor Radford. He knows more than he is letting on." Japp nodded, though he was still visibly shaken by the mysterious disappearance. "But Poirot, how can we be sure he's involved in this? We don't even know where Elizabeth has gone." Poirot's eyes gleamed with the calm certainty that only he could exude. "Ah, mon ami, there are many ways to disappear. Some are simply more subtle than others." The next hour was a blur of questions and false leads. Poirot and Japp made their way through the house, examining every corner, every room, every doorway. No sign of Elizabeth. She had truly disappeared, as though she had never existed. But Poirot was not one to rely on surface appearances. He continued his search, never wavering, his mind working tirelessly to unravel the truth. As they passed through the main hallway, Poirot's attention was caught by something unexpected. The mirror on the wall, large and ornate, was slightly askew, as though it had been moved recently. With a sharp motion, Poirot adjusted it, revealing a narrow doorway behind it, a hidden passage tucked away from view. The door was old, its wood warped with age, but it was unmistakable. Someone had used this passage recently. Japp's eyes widened in disbelief. "What is this, Poirot?" Poirot stepped forward, inspecting the door. He turned the handle with a deliberate slowness, as though savoring the moment of discovery. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit corridor. Beyond a few steps inside, and Poirot's eyes caught sight of something, a trace of fabric, torn and abandoned on the floor. "Ah, this is where she has gone," Poirot said softly, his voice filled with both certainty and quiet triumph. "Elizabeth Hawthorne has not vanished. No, mon ami, she has merely taken the path less visible to the untrained eye." Japp looked at him in confusion. "But she's gone. She's gone, Poirot. We've searched everywhere." Poirot stood still for a moment, his fingers lightly touching the fabric on the floor. His mind raced. This was no simple escape. This was planned. The hidden passage, the torn fabric. It all pointed to someone trying to hide something. But who? The answer came to him in a flash, a sudden realization that struck him like a bolt of lightning. Elizabeth Hawthorne had not disappeared at all. She had been taken by someone who knew the house's secrets better than anyone else. Poirot straightened, his sharp eyes gleaming with determination. "Japp, we are not dealing with a disappearance. We are dealing with a carefully crafted illusion." The investigation had taken a darker turn, and Poirot was already steps ahead, piecing together the threads of a mystery that no one else could see. The night was far from over, and Poirot was about to reveal just how deep the web of deceit truly ran. The question was no longer where Elizabeth Hawthorne had gone. It was why. Why had she been taken? And who was orchestrating this elaborate act of disappearance? As the storm raged on outside, Poirot's mind worked faster, sharpening his focus on the missing woman and the dark secrets buried in the house. He would find the truth, no matter where it led him. And when he did, there would be no more secrets, no more lies, only the cold, hard truth. Chapter 3. A Deadly Confession. The flicker of candlelight cast long shadows across the walls of the grand library. The air in the room was thick with an unsettling stillness, broken only by the sound of the grandfather clock ticking steadily in the corner. But it was not the clock that captured Poirot's attention. It was the man standing before him, trembling, his face drawn with a mixture of guilt and fear. The confession came suddenly, unexpectedly, like a thunderclap in a quiet room. Radford, the estranged son, the one who had been at the center of Poirot's suspicions, stood at the edge of the room, his hand clutched tightly around a glass of brandy, the liquid trembling as much as the man himself. "I did it," Victor whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm raging outside the windows. "I killed my father." Poirot's eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked toward him, his mind already working, already questioning. The room seemed to close in around them. The only sounds, now the steady, rhythmic beat of the rain against the windows and the tense silence that followed Victor's words. Poirot, ever the observer, did not speak immediately. He simply watched, allowing the tension to grow, allowing the truth to slowly unfold before him. Victor's hands trembled as he set the glass down on the nearby table. He looked as if he were about to collapse, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his admission. "I was desperate," he continued, his voice breaking. "Desperate. For my inheritance. My father had cut me off. He was going to change his will, you see. He was going to leave everything to Elizabeth." His eyes narrowed, filled with a hatred that Poirot had not expected to see. "She didn't deserve it. She didn't deserve a penny." Poirot stood still, his mind racing. He had suspected Victor, his nervousness, his strange behavior, his refusal to engage with the rest of the guests. But this was something else entirely. A confession was a dangerous thing. It was easy to claim guilt when there was little to lose, but Poirot knew better than to take words at face value. A confession could be a trap, an attempt to redirect suspicion, a desperate plea for sympathy. "You are certain of this?" Poirot asked, his voice calm, measured. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You killed your father with your own hands?" Victor's face twisted with emotion. "Yes," he snapped, the words coming out in a rush, desperate to make Poirot believe him. "I went to his study, and I confronted him. He told me he was changing his will, that he no longer trusted me. He was going to leave everything to her, to Elizabeth. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't." Poirot's mind sifted through the details. This confession was too easy, too convenient. Victor was a man driven by anger, by a need to reclaim something he believed was rightfully his. But this confession, it did not ring true. Poirot could see the subtle inconsistencies in Victor's story, the cracks in his calm exterior. Something was missing. "Mon ami," Poirot began softly, his voice sharp yet measured. "You speak of rage, of desperation, but your story does not add up. He stepped closer to Victor, his gaze unwavering. You say you killed your father to prevent him from leaving his fortune to Elizabeth, but tell me, why then was Elizabeth not the one found in your father's study that night? Why did you leave the scene untouched, with no signs of struggle? Victor faltered. His eyes darted nervously to the side, as though searching for an escape. I don't know. I don't remember, he muttered, his words stumbling over each other. Poirot took a deliberate step back, his eyes never leaving Victor's face. No, no, my dear fellow, that is not how it works. You do not simply forget a murder. And the victim, they do not simply disappear from your memory. Your actions were planned, were they not? Poirot's gaze flicked toward the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to creep in closer. You knew where your father would be, you knew what he would say, and yet you do not remember. Victor clenched his fists, his entire body tensing as if he were about to snap. I killed him, Poirot. I did. I had to. He was ruining everything. He was going to give everything to her. Poirot's eyes softened, but his mind was already moving. He had seen men like Victor before, desperate, broken men who would say anything to avoid facing the consequences of their actions, but there was something more to this confession, something deeper. Tell me, Victor, Poirot said softly, what of the note? The note left behind by your father, the one that was found in his hand. Victor's face paled, his mouth opened, but no words came out. Poirot could see the panic rising in his eyes, the desperation to cover up the hole in his story. That note, Poirot continued, was not written in haste. It was deliberate, careful, and, mon ami, it did not carry the tone of a man who feared for his life. Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. It was written by a man who was giving a final warning, a warning to someone else, someone who would be watching, someone who would understand the message. Victor swallowed hard, his eyes wide with fear. What are you saying? Poirot stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind piecing together the clues. What I am saying, Victor, is that the confession you so eagerly offer is a carefully constructed lie. Victor recoiled, as though Poirot's words had struck him physically. A lie? He repeated, his voice barely a whisper. What do you mean? I told you the truth. Poirot took a step toward him, his gaze cold and calculating. I believe that you did indeed confront your father, but I do not believe you killed him. No, my friend, that was not your hand that struck the fatal blow. You did not murder Michael Radford, but someone else did. Victor's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition, fear perhaps, crossing his face. What are you saying? Poirot turned away, his gaze sweeping over the room. The killer did not need to hide their identity, for they knew the truth would never come to light. And in their haste, they allowed a simple mistake to occur. You see, Victor, the note left behind was not for you. It was for Elizabeth Hawthorne. Jap, who had been standing silently in the corner, his face a mask of confusion, stepped forward now. Elizabeth? But she disappeared. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Ah, that is where we have been misled. Elizabeth did not disappear, Inspector. She was taken, and the killer left her a clue, one that, if I am correct, will lead us directly to them. Jap looked between the two men, his brow furrowed. But why would Elizabeth be involved? She has no reason to harm anyone. Poirot turned back to Victor, who now seemed to shrink under the weight of the detective's scrutiny. The answer, my dear friend, lies not in the past, but in the present. Elizabeth has been at the center of this web all along, manipulated, used, and now, perhaps, willing to do anything to escape her fate. Victor's face drained of color, his voice shaking. "What do you mean? What are you saying about her?" Poirot stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Victor's. "I believe, mon ami, that Elizabeth Hawthorne is not the innocent woman you think she is. She is, in fact, the key to this entire mystery, and it is she who stands to gain the most if we do not stop her." Victor staggered back, as if struck by a blow. No, it can't be." Poirot's lips curled into a thin, knowing smile. "You see, Victor, it was never about your inheritance. It was always about the woman who stood to inherit everything, and she is the one who orchestrated it all. The game is far from over." As Poirot turned toward the door, his voice low but decisive, he added one final thought that would linger in Victor's mind long after the detective had gone. "The truth, my dear fellow, is always more dangerous than a lie, but rest assured, it will come to light, one way or another." Chapter 4. A Web of Lies. The fire crackled ominously in the hearth, its light casting distorted shadows against the cold stone walls of the sitting room. The wind outside howled in fury, sending torrents of rain against the windows. Inside, the air was thick with the unspoken tension that seemed to hang like a shroud over the group gathered around the table. Hercule Poirot stood at the head of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his sharp eyes moving from one person to the next. The suspects, all of them, sat nervously, unwilling to meet his gaze for too long, their faces painted with a mix of fear and defiance. Poirot's mind was already at work, as it always was, observing, calculating, eliminating. Every word spoken, every gesture, every subtle shift in their posture. These were the clues that he would sift through, that he would unravel to expose the truth. But the truth, as always, was buried beneath a web of lies, and the lies Poirot knew were just as important as the facts themselves. "You see," Poirot began, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife, "it is not enough to simply find the facts. One must also understand the lies, the truths people hide. Ah, but human nature, my dear friends, it never changes." His gaze swept over the group, a knowing glint in his eye. "You have all been caught in a web of your own making. Now, we must untangle it." At the table sat three individuals whose lives had been irrevocably changed by the events of the past days. Elizabeth Hawthorne, the woman who had been at the center of the storm, was still pale, her eyes haunted with the shadow of something dark and unspoken. She shifted nervously in her seat, her fingers tightly clutching a handkerchief, her expression unreadable, save for the subtle twitch of her jaw. Beside her was Victor Radford, the estranged son, whose previous confession had seemed so desperate, so heartfelt. He sat now, stiff and unmoving, his gaze averted, his hands clenched into fists. His earlier vulnerability had been replaced with a coldness, an impenetrable wall that Poirot knew all too well. Beneath that facade, Poirot could sense the seething tension. Victor was hiding something. But what? And finally, there was Michael Radford's widow, the elegant and composed Cynthia Radford. She sat with an air of poised indifference, her face immaculate. But Poirot could see the tension in the way her hands gripped the edge of the chair. She was a woman of mystery, a woman whose cold exterior could not conceal the turmoil that lay beneath. She had secrets too, secrets that Poirot suspected ran much deeper than anyone cared to admit. Poirot's eyes rested for a moment on each of them, his mind turning the puzzle pieces over considering each one, weighing their words, their actions, their motivations. And then, with a quiet certainty, he spoke. "You all lie, I see," Poirot said, his voice soft but firm. "But not all lies are created equal. Some of you lie to protect yourselves, others lie to protect others, and yet others lie because they are afraid of what will happen when the truth is exposed." There was a collective breath held in the room, the tension palpable. Elizabeth's eyes flicked toward Victor, and for a moment, Poirot could see the unspoken communication between them, the subtle exchange that told him more than any words could. "Elizabeth," Poirot continued, his voice calm but penetrating, "you are perhaps the most mysterious of all. You who stand to gain so much, and yet who seem to hold the greatest fear in your eyes. Why is that?" His gaze never left her face, and she squirmed slightly, her fingers tightening around her handkerchief. "I don't know what you mean," Elizabeth said quickly, her voice strained. She was clearly trying to maintain her composure, but the hint of nervousness betrayed her. Poirot smiled faintly, his gaze never wavered. "Ah, but you do know. You see, my dear, you are a woman with much to gain. You were, after all, to inherit a great fortune, your father's money, Victor's inheritance, all in your hands." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But what is it that you fear, mademoiselle? Is it that you have already received more than you deserve?" Elizabeth stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her chest. Poirot turned his attention to Victor then, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "Victor," he said, his voice tinged with a quiet authority, "you have confessed to the murder of your father, but I do not believe you. Non, non, mon ami, your confession was too convenient, too rehearsed." Victor's lips parted as if he were about to protest, but Poirot raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture. "Ah, Victor, the guilty always confess, but not for the reasons they would have us believe. You seek to remove suspicion, to place the blame on your own shoulders, so that the truth will remain hidden. But the truth, it is never so easily buried." Victor's eyes shifted, a flicker of unease crossing his face, but he remained silent. Poirot could see the fear in his eyes, the terror that his confession would not be enough to save him. "And you, Cynthia," Poirot said, his gaze now shifting to the widow. "You have been so quiet, so composed, but perhaps too composed, no? You stand to gain everything from your husband's death. The money, the estate, all of it now belongs to you. But there is something more, isn't there? A secret you wish to keep hidden." Cynthia's face remained impassive, but Poirot could see the subtle way her hand clenched at the armrest. "I don't know what you're insinuating," she replied, her voice cool, but Poirot heard the faintest tremor underneath. Poirot's mind worked quickly, his thoughts falling into place with terrifying precision. "The web is intricate, but it is not impenetrable," he muttered, almost to himself, his fingers drumming lightly on the back of the chair. "Victor, you wanted to blame your father's death on Elizabeth, did you not? But in doing so, you've placed yourself at the center of the crime. Your confession, though, far too clean. It is a mask, an attempt to throw us off your trail." He turned to Elizabeth, who was now visibly shaken, her lips parted as though she wanted to speak but could not find the words. "You, mademoiselle, are not the helpless woman you appear to be. You are, in fact, a master manipulator, playing a game of your own. You have hidden your true intentions behind a veil of innocence, but the lies are starting to unravel." Poirot's eyes then moved to Cynthia, his gaze piercing through her calm exterior. "And you, madame, are the key, the final piece of the puzzle, the one who has been playing both sides, weaving the threads of this web. You knew what your husband intended to do with his fortune, and you knew what Victor was capable of. You have been playing a dangerous game." The room was silent, the weight of Poirot's words pressing down on them all like a heavy cloak. Each of them had been caught in his web of deduction, their secrets laid bare before him. "And now," Poirot continued, his voice soft but laden with finality, "I will show you the truth." In a sudden, almost theatrical motion, Poirot turned toward the fireplace, where the flickering flames cast an eerie glow. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He held it up, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "This, mes amis, is the key," Poirot said, his voice low and certain. "The truth you have all tried so desperately to hide." The paper was a letter from Michael Radford, written in the days before his death. It was addressed to Cynthia, and in it he revealed a secret that none of them could have anticipated, a secret so devastating that it would change everything they thought they knew about the case. Poirot smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. "And now, the game is over. The web of lies has been unraveled. The truth is exposed." The room fell into stunned silence, each person grappling with the revelation. The lies had been laid bare, and now the true killer was known. But the real twist, Poirot knew, lay in the final betrayal that none of them could have foreseen. As the fire crackled and the storm continued to rage outside, Poirot spoke softly, his words lingering in the air. "Ah, but you see, my friends, there is no hiding from the truth. It will always find its way to the surface, no matter how carefully you try to bury it." And with that, the web of lies was finally broken, and the final, devastating twist was revealed. The truth had won, but at what cost? The silence that followed was heavy, a silence that would linger long after the night was over. Chapter 5. The Blood-Stained Letter. The crimson stain was unmistakable. It spread across the letter like a dark omen, the red ink contrasting sharply against the cream-colored paper. The room was eerily still, save for the soft flicker of candlelight casting dancing shadows on the walls. The scent of rain, thick and oppressive, drifted in through the open window as the wind howled in the distance, as though nature itself was urging Hercule Poirot to solve this mystery. He stood motionless, his sharp eyes fixed on the letter before him, his mind already racing through the possibilities, the implications of what this blood-stained message could mean. Poirot's fingers hovered over the letter for a brief moment before he lifted it with great care, as if afraid that the faintest touch might obliterate the delicate balance of the clues it contained. The blood was not accidental. This was not some hasty scribble by a frantic hand. No, this blood, it seemed, had been placed with a meticulous precision that only someone with a deliberate, calculating mind could accomplish, and therein lay the mystery, the final message from a dead man, a clue that seemed to speak louder than any spoken confession ever could. But what did it say? What did it mean? Poirot's mind flitted through countless possibilities, each one more perplexing than the last. "Mon Dieu," Poirot whispered to himself as he studied the letter again. He could already feel the faintest trace of the puzzle beginning to take shape. This letter, this blood-soaked letter, was not merely a message, not merely the final desperate cry of a victim. No, it was something far more dangerous. It was a trap. And as always, Poirot was the intended prey. With the letter in his hands, Poirot turned to the group gathered behind him. They watched him intently, their faces a mixture of confusion, fear, and desperation. Elizabeth Hawthorne, her face drawn and pale, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Victor Radford, who had been caught in the lie of his confession, stared at the letter, his lips pressed tightly together as though trying to keep the truth from spilling out. And then there was Cynthia Radford, her face still composed, but her eyes flickering with something Poirot could not yet place. "I have been contemplating the meaning of this letter," Poirot said, his voice calm, almost detached, as though he were speaking to himself rather than to the others. "It is no ordinary correspondence, no simple farewell from a dying man. This letter was meant to be found. It was meant to send a message, a very specific message." Victor shifted in his seat, his hands clenched into fists. "What are you suggesting, Poirot?" he demanded, his voice low and strained. "That my father wrote this letter and left it behind for someone to find." Poirot's sharp gaze met Victor's, and for a moment he could see the panic flickering in his eyes. "No, no, mon ami," Poirot replied softly. "I believe your father wrote this letter not for you, but for someone else entirely, someone who would know how to read between the lines." Poirot paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. Someone who knew that the message would be deciphered by the right person, at the right time. The room was silent, the tension so thick it seemed to press against the walls. Poirot turned his attention back to the letter, examining the faint smudge of red that had marred its surface. This blood was not a mistake, no. He continued, his voice growing more focused. It was a deliberate act. The blood, the placement of the stain, everything about it points to one thing, a final message from a man who knew he was about to die. A man who wanted to leave behind something that would tie all the pieces together. Elizabeth's voice trembled as she spoke. "But why would he write it like this?" she asked, her eyes wide with confusion. "Why leave a letter stained in blood? What does it mean?" Poirot turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Ah, mademoiselle, that is the question, n'est-ce pas? What does it mean?" He let the question hang in the air for a moment before answering. "The blood, you see, is not just a symbol. It is a clue that will lead us to the truth. But to understand it fully, we must examine the circumstances of Michael Radford's death. We must retrace his final moments." Poirot's mind flashed back to the scene he had found earlier, to the body of Michael Radford lying cold on the floor, the faint signs of struggle around him. It had been a carefully orchestrated murder, one designed to make it appear as though it was the result of a robbery gone wrong or a simple domestic dispute. But Poirot knew better. He had seen the signs. The victim had not been killed by an intruder. No, Michael Radford had known his killer. The signs of familiarity were there, the lack of defensive wounds, the way the body had been arranged, as though the murderer had carefully placed the man in his final resting position. "Let us consider," Poirot began, his voice growing ever more composed, "the events leading up to Radford's death. He was a man of many enemies, yes, a man whose wealth and position had earned him no shortage of grudges. But who among them could have done this? Who had the motive, the opportunity, and the will to kill him in such a way?" Cynthia's gaze faltered at the mention of Radford's enemies, and Poirot caught the fleeting glimpse of something in her eyes, something that she was desperately trying to conceal. Ah, yes, Cynthia Radford, the wife who stood to inherit everything, a woman who had been in the right place at the right time. But Poirot was not so easily fooled. He had seen it before. The calm exterior of a woman who knew exactly how to play the game. "And then there is you, Mademoiselle Hawthorne," Poirot said, turning his attention to Elizabeth. "You, who were once so close to the Radford family. You, who have lived in their shadow for so long, perhaps too long. What did you want from Michael Radford, Elizabeth? What were you willing to do to get it?" Elizabeth's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Poirot saw something else, something sharp and calculating beneath the surface. "I wanted nothing from him," she said, her voice steady, but Poirot knew better than to trust her words. "I was merely trying to help him. But he wouldn't listen. He wouldn't change his will." Her voice faltered slightly. "I thought he was going to leave everything to me. He told me he would. But then he changed his mind." Victor's voice cut through the tension. "What does that have to do with this letter?" he demanded, his anger rising. "What does this have to do with my father's death?" Poirot turned to him slowly, his expression calm. "It has everything to do with it, mon ami. You see, this letter is not just a confession, nor a final farewell. It is a message, one that points directly to the killer. The blood on this paper was meant to serve as a final clue, a final act of defiance. Michael Radford knew who had betrayed him, and he wanted that person to understand the consequences of their actions." Poirot looked down at the letter again, his fingers lightly tracing the red stain. "This blood, this mark, it is a symbol. It is a mark of guilt, a mark of betrayal, and it will lead us to the truth. But who among you will stand before me as the murderer? Who will confess when the time comes?" The room was silent once more, the weight of Poirot's words hanging heavily in the air. The flickering candlelight cast shadows across the walls, but it was the shadows in their hearts that Poirot sought to expose. Each of them had something to hide. Each of them had a motive, but only one of them could be the killer. Poirot looked up, his gaze piercing through each of them, his mind already piecing together the final pieces of the puzzle. "The truth, my friends, will soon be revealed, and when it is, it will change everything." And with that, the investigation took its final turn, the blood-stained letter now at the heart of the mystery, its meaning clearer than ever. But what did it truly mean? The answer, Poirot knew, was just within reach. The storm raged on outside, but inside, the silence of the room was deafening. Poirot was closing in. Chapter 6. A Twist in the Shadows. The thunder cracked so violently that the entire house seemed to tremble. The storm outside lashed against the windows with an unforgiving force, rain pelting the glass in torrents. But it was not the storm that held the room in a vice-like grip. It was the silence. The heavy, oppressive silence that hung in the air like a dense fog. A silence that felt more like a warning than a mere absence of sound. In the dim light of the study, Hercule Poirot stood, alone, the flickering candlelight casting sharp shadows across his face, accentuating the lines of concentration etched deeply on his brow. His eyes were fixed on the scene before him, his mind racing, as if he were piecing together a puzzle that defied all logic. Before him, the room seemed still, but Poirot knew better. There were secrets hiding in every corner, every crevice, every quiet movement. The air was thick with suspicion, and Poirot's mind ticked with precision as always, searching for patterns, for truths that lay beneath the surface. But as the storm raged on outside, it felt as though the very walls of the house were closing in on him. Something was not right. Someone was hiding something, and Poirot had come to a chilling realization. The murderer, the one who had cast this shadow over the investigation, was still in this room. The faint creak of a floorboard behind him made Poirot turn. A woman stood in the doorway. Cynthia Radford, her face pale, her eyes wide, with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I need to speak with you, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice low, barely audible above the roar of the storm. Poirot studied her with a practiced gaze. There was something in her demeanor, something in the way she hesitated at the threshold, that piqued his curiosity. Was she merely anxious, or was there something deeper behind her unease? "Please, madame, come in," Poirot said, his voice warm but measured. "There is no need for such distress. We are all, it seems, quite involved in this web of intrigue." Cynthia stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "It's not safe," she whispered urgently. I think someone is trying to frame me. Someone is using me as a pawn in their game." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his gaze never wavering. "Ah, madame, but you have already played your part, and we, the detectives, are left to figure out who else has played theirs." She faltered, then looked around nervously, her eyes flicking to the windows. "I didn't kill Michael," she said, her voice growing more desperate. "But I know who did. I know who's behind this whole thing. They're using me, and I don't know how to get out of this. I need your help, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing for a moment, allowing the silence to settle in the room once more. There was something about her words, something about her manner that didn't sit right with him. "Madame, you speak of things that you cannot know for certain," Poirot said slowly, his voice still calm, but with an edge of suspicion. "If you know who the killer is, why not tell the police? Why come to me?" Cynthia looked away, her gaze dropping to the floor. Because I am afraid. If I speak up, I will be next. They'll make sure of it. And I can't let that happen." Poirot's sharp mind flicked to a new possibility, one that only deepened the mystery. Who was she protecting? Who did she fear more than the law? "Ah, but there are so many hiding in the shadows, madame," Poirot murmured, stepping closer. "Each of you, each suspect, plays their role, but I suspect someone is not playing by the same rules." He paused. "Someone is lying." Cynthia's face turned ashen, her eyes wide with the fear of being exposed. Poirot's attention now shifted to the room around them. Shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should, as if the darkness was creeping in from all sides. "Tell me," Poirot continued, his voice soft but firm, "who is behind the lies? Who is hiding the truth in the shadows?" For a long moment, Cynthia was silent, her breathing shallow. Finally, her gaze flicked up to meet Poirot's. "Victor," she whispered, the name hanging in the air between them, like a blade. "Victor Radford is behind it. He's been planning this from the very beginning. I can't prove it, but I know it. He's been pulling strings." Poirot's sharp eyes studied her for a moment longer before he spoke. "I see," he said quietly. "You say you cannot prove it, but perhaps you are only seeing the web from your own perspective. You are, after all, far too close to the situation, madame." Cynthia clenched her fists. "You don't understand. He's been manipulating everything. The inheritance, the will, everything. He killed Michael to make sure he would get what he wanted." Poirot nodded slowly, considering her words. Yes, I understand. And yet, you leave out the most important piece of the puzzle." He turned away from her, pacing slowly in the dim light of the study. "You see," Poirot continued, his voice steady and measured. It is not always so simple. There are no straightforward answers in this case. Everyone has secrets. Everyone has something to hide. But in order to uncover the truth, we must look not only at the people involved, but at their motives. Everyone has something to gain. Poirot turned back to face Cynthia, his eyes gleaming with the sharpness of a man who had pieced together a truth no one else could. See, you, madame, are the key to unlocking the mystery. You know far more than you let on. You have hidden yourself behind lies and fears. But I ask you now, what have you truly been hiding? Before Cynthia could answer, a loud crash echoed through the house, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps from the hall. Poirot's eyes flashed toward the door, his mind already racing through the possibilities. "Stay here, madame," Poirot said quietly, turning toward the door. "I will be back shortly." He stepped into the hallway, the candlelight flickering behind him, casting long shadows on the walls. He moved quickly, his steps silent on the creaky wooden floors. In the distance, he could hear voices, low, hurried voices, coming from the library. It was time to confront the others, time to uncover the truth. As Poirot approached the library, he slowed his steps, his keen ears picking up the tension in the air. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, Poirot could just make out the figures inside. He saw Victor standing rigid, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Beside him, Elizabeth was speaking in a low voice, her words indistinguishable from the distance, but Poirot could see the way she was leaning in, her face a mask of intense focus. He pushed the door open gently, stepping into the room with the quiet authority that only Poirot could command. "Ah, my friends," he said softly, his voice cutting through the tension. "It seems we are all hiding something, are we not?" The three of them turned toward him, their faces betraying a moment of shock, but it was Victor who spoke first, his voice shaky. "Poirot, what are you doing here?" Poirot smiled, his expression calm, yet knowing. "I am simply putting together the pieces of a puzzle, mon ami, and I find that the puzzle grows clearer with every passing moment. Tell me, Victor, why were you hiding in the shadows? What is it that you do not want me to see?" Victor's eyes darted nervously, and for a moment, Poirot could almost hear the man's thoughts racing. Victor started, but then his voice faltered. Poirot raised his hand gently. "No need to answer yet. The truth, you see, has a way of revealing itself when we least expect it." He turned to Elizabeth, who had gone silent, watching him closely. "And you, mademoiselle, have you been a willing participant in this little game? Or are you, too, a victim of the shadows?" The storm outside howled louder, as if in answer to Poirot's question. The room seemed to close in on them, the walls pressing tighter with every passing second. A final truth was close, too close, and Poirot could feel it in his bones. And then, in the darkness, in the silence that followed his question, the answer came. The twist was just beginning. Chapter 7. The Secret Room. The echo of footsteps down the long, narrow corridor was the only sound in the house. The walls, lined with old tapestries and heavy drapery, absorbed the sound, creating a haunting silence that seemed to press in on all sides. The air was thick, heavy with dust and disuse, a sense of abandonment that crept under the skin. Poirot, his figure sharp and precise in his dark suit, moved with deliberate grace, his mind racing as fast as his footsteps. There was something here, something he could feel in the very air, something hidden for far too long. And it was in this house, this house full of secrets, that the truth awaited him. He paused in front of a wooden door, dark and ancient, its frame warped with age. A faint line of dust clung to the edges as if it had been undisturbed for decades. But Poirot knew better than to trust appearances. He had seen this before. The hidden rooms, the secrets buried beneath layers of time. His eyes scanned the door closely, his mind already calculating the possible scenarios, his sharp intellect piecing together the puzzle in real time. The key to everything, the key to unraveling the entire mystery, was locked behind this door. Poirot reached out, his gloved hand brushing against the cold metal of the door handle. As his fingers grasped it, a faint shiver of realization passed through him. This was it. This was the moment when everything would be exposed. The room that had been kept locked away for years. The room that held the answers to all of their questions. With a soft click, the door opened. A thick, musty smell poured out. The scent of old wood, mildew, and years of neglect. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of light, filtering through the cracks in the shutters. Poirot stepped inside, his boots making no sound on the creaky floorboards. The space before him was small, cramped, with barely enough room to move. The air was thick, oppressive. Something about it felt wrong, as though the room itself was holding its breath. And then Poirot saw it. In the corner of the room, covered in a dusty sheet, was an object, half hidden from view. His breath caught for a brief moment, as though his very soul understood the significance of what lay before him. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing, every muscle in his body taut with anticipation. With a swift motion, he pulled the sheet away. The object revealed itself. A large, ornate chest, its wood dark and aged, its metal hinges tarnished with time. The chest seemed out of place here, as though it did not belong in this forsaken room. A small lock adorned the chest, but it was nothing that Poirot's keen eyes and deft fingers couldn't overcome. He quickly unlatched it, the soft click of the lock seeming to echo louder than it should in the stillness of the room. Poirot opened the chest slowly, almost reverently. Inside, piled high, were papers, documents of all kinds, some old, some yellowed with age, others crumpled, as if hastily, shoved into the chest. But there was something else, something that caught his eye. A thick, leather-bound book, its cover worn, its pages yellowed and fragile with time. He lifted it carefully, running his fingers over the spine, a chill creeping up his spine as he realized what it was. A journal, a diary, to be exact. And it was in this very journal that the final truth would be found. Poirot's thoughts raced as he began to flip through the pages. The handwriting was elegant, precise, but as he read, he began to feel a gnawing sensation in his gut. The entries were dated years ago, long before Michael Radford's death, long before the series of events that had brought them all together. But the words were unmistakable. This journal belonged to someone who had known far too much, someone who had seen everything unfold from the shadows. He scanned the pages quickly, his eyes moving faster than his thoughts could fully process. But then something caught his attention. A name that stood out above all the others. Elizabeth Hawthorne, and beside it, a note. She cannot be allowed to take what is mine. Poirot's mind raced, his pulse quickening. This was it. This was the clue he had been searching for. The true motive behind Michael Radford's death had been hidden in plain sight, tucked away in the forgotten corners of this secret room. Elizabeth, who had been at the center of the storm from the beginning, was not as innocent as she appeared. But the question remained, what had she done, and why? Poirot's thoughts swirled as he put the journal back in the chest, his fingers trailing over the edges of the chest as if hoping for another revelation. He had to find her. He had to confront her before the lies became even more entangled. He turned on his heel, his eyes scanning the room one final time, his sharp mind already calculating the next steps. But as he reached the door, a faint sound stopped him, a creak of the floorboards, a soft shuffle behind him. Someone else was in the room, someone who had been hiding in the shadows all along. He whirled around, his gaze locking on the figure standing in the doorway. It was Victor Radford, his face pale, his hands trembling, but his eyes filled with a strange mixture of fear and defiance. "You shouldn't have come in here," Victor said, his voice shaky but filled with an undeniable edge. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind already racing through the implications of what Victor's words meant. "And yet, my dear friend, I believe I have discovered everything I need to know. It is you, is it not? You who have been hiding in the shadows. You who have been pulling the strings all along." Victor flinched, his face paling further. He stepped back, his hands moving in an almost defensive manner. "No, Poirot, you don't understand. You don't know what you're talking about. It's not what you think." Poirot tilted his head, his expression calm but resolute. But I believe it is exactly what I think. You have been lying, Victor, hiding your involvement, manipulating everyone around you. But the truth, as always, has a way of coming to light." Victor's eyes darted to the chest, to the journal that Poirot had left open, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. For a moment, he seemed to deflate, his shoulders slumping in resignation. "I never wanted it to end like this," Victor muttered, "but there was no other way. My father, he was going to take everything from me, everything I worked for, everything I deserved. I couldn't let that happen." Poirot's gaze softened, but his voice was firm. "So, you killed your father. You killed him to ensure that you would inherit everything. But it was not just about the money, was it? It was about control, about power." Victor's face twisted in anguish, his eyes filling with a mix of guilt and regret. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just wanted my life back. I wanted to take control of what was mine." Poirot stepped closer, his eyes locking with Victor's. "And in doing so, you have destroyed everything. You have destroyed your family, your own future, all for the sake of greed." Victor collapsed to his knees, his face buried in his hands, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. "I didn't want to kill him. I didn't want to hurt anyone, but I had no choice." Poirot watched him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them like an endless void. The storm outside had finally begun to subside, but the stillness inside the room felt heavier than ever. "There is always a choice, Victor," Poirot said softly, "but it is too late now. The truth has been revealed." Victor looked up, his eyes filled with despair. "What now, Poirot? What will happen to me?" Poirot's expression was unreadable, but there was a hint of sadness in his gaze. "Justice, my friend, will take its course, and you will have to answer for your actions." As Poirot turned to leave the room, the storm finally began to die down, the first rays of dawn creeping through the windows. The truth had been uncovered, the shadows had been revealed, and the pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. But for Victor, There would be no escape from the consequences of his choices. Poirot's final words echoed in the quiet room as he stepped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind him. Ah, but human nature. It never changes. Chapter 8. The Alibi That Shattered. The clock struck midnight, its deep chimes reverberating through the silent manor, a solemn warning echoing against the walls of the grand hallway. The storm outside howled with violent force, rattling the old windows, while within the house an unsettling quiet gripped the air. A flicker of candlelight danced across the room, casting ghostly shadows that seemed to watch every movement. In this fragile moment of eerie stillness, Hercule Poirot stood before the man who thought he had created the perfect alibi. The tension was palpable, a heaviness pressing against Poirot's chest, but his mind was already working, sharply, precisely, without hesitation. It was Victor Radford who had been under Poirot's scrutiny for the longest time. He had played his part well, the anguished son, the distraught heir, the man who had professed his guilt before the world. He had even crafted an alibi so flawless that no one would dare question it. But Poirot knew better. No alibi, no matter how perfect it seemed, could withstand the test of careful inspection. Victor's face was pale, his eyes haunted by the weight of his own confession, though Poirot suspected it had all been a performance, a well-crafted lie. The room felt like it was shrinking, the shadows growing darker with every passing second. Poirot's sharp gaze never wavered as he studied Victor. "Ah, monsieur," Poirot began, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "You say you were with your mother at the time of your father's death. Your mother, who can provide you with the perfect alibi." His words lingered in the air, heavy with accusation. "But I wonder, Victor, how reliable is this alibi? And how much of your truth is really a well-crafted lie?" Victor's jaw clenched, his lips pressed tight, but he remained silent as though trying to contain the storm of panic brewing beneath the surface. Poirot's eyes never left him, his face an inscrutable mask. Victor shifted, uncomfortably, in his seat. "What are you insinuating, Poirot?" "My mother—" "Ah, but you see, I am not insinuating," Poirot interjected smoothly. "I am simply asking questions. Questions that, I believe, have not been answered. How is it, monsieur, that on the night of your father's death, you were the only one who had such a perfect alibi, a witness who swears to your every move? Surely the universe does not arrange itself so neatly, non? Life is more complicated than that." Victor shifted, again his nervousness starting to show. "You don't understand," he said, his voice strained. "I was with her, I swear. She saw me. She knows—" "But did she?" Poirot's voice cut through Victor's words like a knife. "Your mother is— how shall I say this? She is not known for being a particularly reliable witness, is she, Victor?" Poirot took a step closer, his gaze narrowing. "You have already admitted to lying once, my friend. Why should I trust that this particular alibi is the truth?" Victor recoiled, his eyes flicking nervously toward the door, as though hoping for a distraction. "I told you the truth," he almost shouted, his fists clenched on his lap. "I had nothing to do with it. I was with her. I was not there." Poirot smiled softly, his voice quiet, but filled with quiet authority. "I believe you believe that, monsieur. And I believe you are convinced of your innocence. But you see, the problem lies in the details that you overlook." Poirot's eyes seemed to pierce through Victor, his expression unreadable. "The truth, it always reveals itself, even when it hides behind a well-constructed story. Victor opened his mouth to speak, but Poirot raised a hand, silencing him with a simple gesture. You see, monsieur, you are not the only one with secrets, and I suspect you may not be the only one who is lying. I must ask you again, what truly happened that night? Victor's face twisted with frustration, his eyes darting toward the walls, the windows, anywhere but at Poirot. I don't know what you want from me. I already told you what happened. Poirot leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. What happened, or what you want us to believe happened? The storm outside intensified, the wind screeching against the house, as if nature itself was caught up in the tension in the room. Victor's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the glass of water on the table. Poirot's eyes followed the movement, his sharp mind catching every nuance, every subtle change in Victor's demeanor. Tell me, Victor, Poirot said, his voice low and thoughtful. Did you ever think that someone might be manipulating the truth just as you have? Someone who has been watching, waiting for the right moment to plant their own version of events in your mind. Poirot's gaze never wavered. Someone who knows exactly how to twist the truth and how to use you to cover their own tracks? Victor froze. The color drained from his face, and for the first time, Poirot saw true fear in his eyes. He had been played, and now the game was turning against him. Your alibi, monsieur, Poirot continued, is not as foolproof as you think. It is, in fact, the key to unlocking the entire mystery. You, Victor, are not the innocent man you pretend to be. Poirot's voice gained strength as he laid the groundwork for the reveal. The truth, as always, lies hidden in the shadows. The room fell silent for a long moment. Poirot let the weight of his words settle over the young man, watching as he visibly struggled to come to terms with what had just been said. The guilt, the fear, and the realization were all playing out before him, and Poirot could feel the tension beginning to break. I didn't, Victor began, his voice cracking, but Poirot shook his head gently, as though to stop him from continuing. Ah, monsieur, the time for half-truths is over, Poirot said, his voice firm. Let us move forward. You may have lied, but you are not the only one. Victor's shoulders sagged as he finally let the truth slip through the cracks in his composure. I didn't kill my father, he whispered, almost as if trying to convince himself more than Poirot. But I thought it was the only way to get what I needed. I couldn't let him change the will. I couldn't. Poirot held up his hand, silencing Victor once more. It was not your father's will that was the issue, was it? Poirot's sharp eyes narrowed. No. There was someone else who had been pulling the strings, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Someone who knew your weaknesses, your fears. Victor's face twisted, a look of realization dawning on him, but it was too late. Poirot turned, his mind already moving to the next phase of the investigation. The game had shifted. The real mastermind was still out there, hiding in plain sight. I believe, Victor, Poirot said, his voice cold, that you were merely a pawn in someone else's game. A game you were too eager to play. He turned sharply to the door, his eyes flashing with determination. And now, it is time to expose the true killer. The storm outside had settled into an uneasy quiet, the winds dying down as Poirot's words hung in the air. But even as he spoke, Poirot knew the truth. The final twist was coming, and it would shatter everything they thought they knew. Victor's face was ashen, his body trembling as he collapsed into the chair, defeated. But Poirot was already a step ahead. His eyes locked on the door. The final act was about to begin. The pieces were falling into place, and soon the full extent of the deception would be revealed. But the greatest twist of all was still hidden in the shadows. "Ah," Poirot muttered to himself as he walked out of the room, his mind already working on the next move. "The truth, mon ami, is never as simple as it seems." And with that, he disappeared into the depths of the house, leaving behind a trail of confusion, fear, and, most importantly, the promise of justice. The web was about to collapse, and Poirot would be there, ready to unravel the final thread. Chapter 9. The Vanishing Footprints. The night was as dark as it had ever been, the moon hidden behind heavy clouds that seemed to press against the heavens, suffocating any light. The storm had passed, but the air was thick with an unnatural stillness, like the world itself was holding its breath. Then a sound broke the silence, a soft, almost imperceptible scrape of shoes on the wet ground. Poirot stood at the edge of the manor's garden, his eyes sharp as a hawk's, staring down at the damp earth beneath his feet. In the faint glow of a single lantern, the scene before him was a haunting one. Footprints. The trail was unmistakable at first glance. A set of footprints, clearly visible in the wet soil, leading away from the back of the manor and vanishing into the dense fog. But as Poirot crouched down to examine them, his sharp eyes flicked back and forth, studying the path with a growing sense of unease. These were no ordinary footprints. The impression they left was strange, unsettling. There was something unnatural about their placement. It was as though they were disappearing. Poirot leaned closer, his mind already processing the evidence. The earth around the footprints was too clean, too smooth in places. There were gaps in the trail, places where the footprints didn't match the ground, as if they had been erased, or perhaps created. "Mon Dieu," Poirot muttered to himself, his fingers tracing the outline of the largest footprint. A trail that vanishes. But was it ever real? He stood up slowly, turning to the others who had gathered behind him. They stood in silence, waiting for his judgment, their faces a mixture of confusion and hope. Each one had their own theories, their own suspicions, but Poirot knew that no one had yet seen what he had seen. The trail was a riddle, and it was only through his keen eye for detail that the answer could be found. "We are all following shadows," Poirot said, his voice soft, but carrying an unmistakable authority. "Each of you believes that these footprints lead us somewhere, to a place of truth. But I ask you, mes amis, where do they truly lead? To a man? To a woman? Or to a lie?" The wind shifted slightly, rustling the trees overhead, as if the very earth was whispering secrets that only Poirot could hear. He turned to face the others, his expression calm, but filled with a quiet intensity. "I must ask you," Poirot continued, his gaze locking on to each person in turn, "who has been walking in these footprints? Who among you is creating the trail, and who is simply following it?" The first suspect was Elizabeth Hawthorne. She stood to the side, her face pale in the lantern light, her eyes darting nervously between the footprints and Poirot. She had been at the center of the investigation from the very beginning, her past tangled with Michael Radford's, her future now uncertain in the wake of his death. She had a motive, and she had something to hide. But did she have the audacity to leave behind a false trail? Poirot's gaze shifted to Victor Radford, his face still marked by the signs of guilt. the weight of his confession hanging like a shadow over him. He had given an alibi, one so carefully constructed that it had seemed perfect. Too perfect, perhaps. His every word, his every action seemed rehearsed. And yet there were cracks in the story, and now these vanishing footprints. Could they be part of his plan, part of a scheme to mislead them all? And then there was Cynthia Radford, who had always remained a mystery. She was cold, composed, almost too composed. Her eyes betrayed nothing, her expressions always carefully controlled. But Poirot knew that beneath the surface there was more to her than met the eye. She had lived in the shadows of her late husband's wealth, and now, with his death, she stood to inherit everything. But did she want more than just money? What was hidden beneath her perfect mask? Could she be the one leaving behind this strange, disappearing trail? Poirot took a step back, his eyes scanning the foggy night, his mind already working through the possibilities. He could feel it, the pressure building, the sense that the answers were right there, just beyond reach. But there was something he had overlooked, something small, something crucial. The footprints were a distraction. They were meant to lead him astray. Ah, but human nature, it never changes, Poirot thought to himself. People will always try to hide their tracks, but they forget one thing. The truth cannot be erased. It cannot vanish. It remains hidden in the details. Poirot crouched once again, studying the footprints with a renewed sense of clarity. The way the soil had been disturbed in places, the way the earth seemed to shift unnaturally beneath the prints. It was all wrong. He stood up suddenly, a realization dawning on him. These footprints were not real. They were not the product of someone walking away. They were the result of someone trying to make it appear as though they had walked away. "The trail is a lie," Poirot said aloud, his voice filled with quiet certainty. "This was never the path of the murderer. This is the path of someone who wanted us to believe in a story that isn't true." The others stared at him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Elizabeth, Victor, and Cynthia all exchanged quick, nervous glances, each of them trying to process Poirot's words. "No," Poirot continued, his voice cutting through the tension. "The footprints were not made by the killer. They were made by someone who wanted us to think they were, but they were planted. Fake. A carefully crafted illusion." "Then who—" Victor began, but Poirot silenced him with a raised hand. "I know who," Poirot said, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of satisfaction and resolve. "And now we must uncover the truth, no matter where it leads." There was a moment of silence, thick with the weight of Poirot's words. He knew the answer. He had always known. The vanishing footprints had been nothing more than a clever distraction, a red herring designed to lead them down a false path. And now the real killer, whoever it was, would have to face the consequences of their actions. Poirot turned to face the group, his voice cold and certain. "The trail that disappears, it was never meant to be found, but it has led us here, to this moment, and now the truth will come to light." As Poirot walked back toward the manor, the others following, silently behind him, his mind was already working on the final piece of the puzzle. The murderer had made a mistake, perhaps the only mistake they had made, and Poirot was not about to let it go unnoticed. Inside the manor, Poirot stood before the gathered suspects, his mind finally at rest, the pieces of the puzzle falling neatly into place. There was no more running from the truth. The vanishing footprints had been a ruse, but now Poirot would expose the real story. He would reveal the person who had been hiding in plain sight, pulling the strings all along. "The time has come," Poirot said, his voice quiet, but full of authority. "The truth will no longer be hidden. The one who has been behind all of this, the one who thought they could erase their tracks, is standing before us." There was a moment of hushed silence before Poirot continued, his words as sharp as ever. "You have been trying to escape your past, to erase your footprints, but as I have shown you, the truth is always there, waiting to be uncovered." And with that, the final twist came into focus, the answer to the mystery now within reach. "Ah, the shadows," Poirot mused to himself, his voice quiet but filled with finality. "They are not so dark when one knows where to look." The murderer had been hiding in plain sight, and now the truth was about to be exposed in the most dramatic way possible. Chapter 10. Poirot's Fatal Doubt. The clock struck midnight, its deep chimes reverberating through the empty halls of the old manor. But it wasn't the chimes that caused a shiver to run down Hercule Poirot's spine. It was the silence, the oppressive, suffocating silence that seemed to fill every corner of the house. He stood motionless in the center of the grand study, his sharp eyes scanning the room one last time. The shadows that clung to the walls seemed to stretch longer, and the air felt thick, as though something unseen was watching him, waiting. Poirot had solved many cases in his time, unraveling webs of lies and deceit with ease. But tonight, in this house, there was something different, a coldness in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. The murderer had been revealed, or so Poirot thought, but as he stood there, a nagging feeling lingered in his mind, refusing to let him rest. A doubt, a tiny, insistent doubt that he had missed something vital, something crucial, that could change everything. The quiet murmur of voices from the other room reached his ears, but it was as if he were hearing them from a great distance. He shook his head slightly, trying to shake off the growing unease that had begun to gnaw at him. He had spent hours questioning the suspects, piecing together their lies, their motives, their actions. The truth had seemed so clear, and yet as his eyes fell on the small, inconspicuous object on the desk, something that had been there all along, Poirot's mind snapped back into focus. It was a letter, half hidden beneath a stack of papers. He had seen it earlier, but had dismissed it as irrelevant. Now, with an unsettling feeling rising in his chest, Poirot picked it up. His eyes scanned the neatly written words, and as he did, the realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. This letter, this seemingly insignificant letter, was the one thing he had missed. A sharp intake of breath escaped Poirot's lips. The letters on the page swam before his eyes, their meaning becoming clearer with each passing second. It was a letter from Michael Radford, written just days before his death, addressed to none other than Cynthia Radford. But it wasn't the contents of the letter that struck Poirot. It was the postscript, hastily scribbled in a hurried hand, almost as though Radford had written it in his final moments. "She knows. Don't trust her." Poirot felt his pulse quicken. A cold shiver ran through his body as he realized the full weight of those words. She knows. Radford had known something, something that no one else had seen. And the one person who had been hiding something all along, the one person who had been manipulating the truth, was Cynthia. The wife, the widow, the woman who had appeared so calm, so composed, had been playing a far more dangerous game than Poirot had ever suspected. His mind raced through the events of the past days. Cynthia's perfect alibi, her carefully constructed persona, everything had been too neat, too clean. She had been hiding in plain sight, using her charm, her elegance, to manipulate the investigation. And all the while, Poirot had been blind to the one thing that could shatter everything. The truth, it seemed, had been staring him in the face the entire time. But Cynthia's deception had been so expertly crafted, so flawlessly executed, that even he, Hercule Poirot, had been taken in. The weight of the realization pressed down on him. His own fatal doubt, the one thing he had overlooked, had cost him precious time. And now, as the storm outside began to howl once more, Poirot knew that the truth was far more complex, more dangerous than he had ever imagined. He turned swiftly, his gaze sharp as he walked toward the door. There was no time to waste. The truth had been exposed, but there was still one final step to take. The pieces were falling into place, but Poirot knew he had to act quickly before the killer could slip away into the shadows once again. He entered the sitting room where the others had gathered. Elizabeth Hawthorne, her face pale with exhaustion, sat at the edge of her chair, her eyes flicking nervously toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. Victor Radford, his face drawn with anxiety, paced back and forth, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Cynthia, however, sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on Poirot, her face the picture of calm. Too calm. "Ah, Cynthia," Poirot said softly, his voice like velvet, but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I have read your husband's letter, the one you thought would remain hidden forever." Cynthia's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I don't know what you're talking about, Poirot." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "Oh, I think you do. The letter, written just days before your husband's death, addressed to you. The postscript. She knows. Don't trust her." He paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. It was not Michael Radford who was hiding the truth. It was you. A flicker of fear crossed Cynthia's face, but she quickly masked it with a tight smile. "You've made a mistake, Poirot. That letter means nothing." "No, mademoiselle," Poirot said, his voice calm but firm. "It means everything. It means that you knew what was going to happen. You knew that your husband was about to change his will. You knew that his fortune, his wealth, was slipping away from your grasp." Poirot's eyes hardened. "And you took matters into your own hands." Cynthia's lips tightened, but she said nothing. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with the weight of the truth now being revealed. "Tell me, Cynthia," Poirot continued, his voice softer now, but laced with finality. "Was it worth it? The deception, the lies, the manipulation? Was it worth taking everything from your husband? From Victor?" Cynthia's gaze flickered to her son, and for a brief moment, Poirot saw the flicker of something cold, something calculating in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say a word, the door swung open with a loud creak, and Inspector Japp entered, his face grim. "Poirot," Japp said, his voice heavy with urgency. "We've found something I think you'll want to see." Poirot's gaze flicked toward Japp, his mind already racing. "What is it, mon ami?" Japp stepped forward, holding a small folded piece of paper in his hand. It was found in Elizabeth's room, hidden in the drawer of her desk. At first, we thought it was unrelated, but then we saw the handwriting. It's Michael Radford's. Poirot's eyes widened slightly, his mind already calculating the implications. "What does it say?" Japp unfolded the paper, his voice steady but with a note of disbelief. "It's a confession, Poirot. A confession that Michael Radford knew everything. He knew about Cynthia. He knew what she was planning, and he was going to expose her. But before Japp could finish, Poirot's eyes flicked to Cynthia, her face now drained of all color. Before he could, he was murdered. Poirot finished for him, his voice quiet but filled with certainty. "Exactly," Japp said, his voice low. "But there's one more thing. The letter. Michael had been planning to reveal everything at a family gathering. He was going to confront Cynthia, to tell everyone the truth about what she had done. But before that could happen, someone silenced him." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. It all clicked into place now. The alibis, the false trails, the manipulations, it had all been part of Cynthia's plan. She had orchestrated everything with one goal in mind: to maintain her control, to ensure that no one would ever learn the truth. Poirot turned to face Cynthia, his voice cold, but filled with a quiet resolve. "You thought you could get away with it, didn't you? But the truth, Cynthia, always comes to light." Cynthia's lips trembled, but she remained silent. The storm outside had faded, and the silence in the room felt like the calm after a violent storm. Poirot had uncovered the final piece of the puzzle. The truth was out, and it was time for justice to take its course. But as Poirot turned to leave, his mind lingered on the final, chilling thought. Even he, the great Hercule Poirot, had missed something. A single doubt had threatened to derail everything. Could it have cost him more than he realized? Only time would tell. For now, the case was closed. The truth had been revealed, and justice, as always, would prevail. "Ah," Poirot muttered to himself as he walked toward the door. "Human nature, it never changes." Chapter 11. The final reveal. The storm had been building in intensity for hours, a dark symphony of crashing thunder and howling winds. The flickering candlelight in the study barely held against the power of the storm outside. It cast shadows that stretched like long fingers across the walls, bending the light, distorting the room. In the midst of the darkness, Hercule Poirot stood tall, his sharp eyes focused on the group before him. He could feel the air thick with tension, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to be revealed. But Poirot had known, deep within himself, that this moment would come. And now it had arrived. The suspects were all gathered before him, their faces betraying varying degrees of fear, anxiety, and, in some cases, barely contained anger. Elizabeth Hawthorne, the woman who had seemed so innocent, so vulnerable, had played her role well, but Poirot could see the cracks in her composure. Victor Radford, the estranged son, had confessed so readily, but the pieces never fit quite right. And then there was Cynthia Radford, the elegant widow, whose calm facade had been almost too perfect, too controlled. There had always been something more beneath the surface, something that Poirot had not yet fully understood. But now, as the storm outside raged, he was about to uncover the final, devastating truth. "The time has come." Poirot's voice broke the silence, a sharp and deliberate whisper. His words cut through the heavy tension like a scalpel. "The moment of truth has arrived, mes amis. The killer is not who you think." A collective breath seemed to be held in the room. Everyone was watching him, their eyes flicking between one another, uncertain, trying to piece together the puzzle. But Poirot had already pieced it together. The game was over. He took a step forward, his gaze sweeping over the faces of those who had been involved in the investigation. You see, all of you have been hiding something. A small lie here, a little deception there. But in the end, it was not the lies that gave you away. No, it was the truth, hidden beneath the layers of falsehood. Poirot paused, allowing his words to settle over the group. His eyes lingered on Cynthia, who stood near the fireplace, her fingers lightly brushing against the back of a chair. Her face remained composed, but Poirot could see the way her eyes flicked to the door, a subtle shift that gave away her anxiety. She was the one who had managed to keep her calm throughout the investigation, the one who had fooled everyone into believing that her grief was genuine. But Poirot had always suspected there was more to her story than she had let on. The clues were all there, Poirot continued, his voice quiet but filled with an undeniable authority. The inconsistencies, the strange behaviors, the unspoken tension between you all. But there was one thing that none of you accounted for: the human mind, the way it betrays itself when it is forced to hide the truth. Victor Radford shifted uncomfortably beside his mother, his eyes flicking nervously toward Poirot. "You have no right to accuse us without proof," he snapped, his voice strained. Poirot's gaze moved to him, his expression unfazed. "Ah, monsieur," Poirot said softly, "it is not the proof that gives me the answer. It is the understanding of what motivates people. The human heart is a complex thing, but I have learned to recognize the patterns, the small details that others miss." He turned back to Cynthia, his eyes piercing. "You thought you could get away with it, didn't you, madame? You thought your perfect alibi would keep you safe, but you failed to account for one thing, the smallest of details that would eventually unravel everything." Cynthia stiffened, but she did not speak. Her gaze remained steady, though there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a crack in the facade. Poirot had seen it. "The key to this entire mystery," Poirot said, his voice firm, "lies not in the obvious lies, but in the smallest truths. The truth that we overlook. The one thing that nobody suspected." Poirot turned and looked directly at Elizabeth. Her eyes widened slightly, and she took a small, almost imperceptible step back. "Ah, mademoiselle," Poirot said, his voice calm but insistent. "You too have played your part. You have been hiding something from us, something so small, so insignificant, that even I failed to see it at first." Elizabeth's face paled, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes, mademoiselle, you wanted us to believe in your innocence. You wanted us to believe you were the victim in this story. But the truth is more complicated than that. You were not just a victim. You were complicit." He turned back to Cynthia, his gaze unwavering. "And you, madame, were the mastermind behind it all. You wanted Michael Radford dead, not for the inheritance alone, but because of a secret that he had kept from you, a secret that he was about to reveal, the truth about your past." Cynthia's lips pressed tightly together, but she remained silent. Poirot could see the shift in her expression, the brief flicker of panic before she regained control. "The truth about your past, madame," Poirot continued, "is what led you to kill him. You had been hiding a secret for years, a secret so deep, so dangerous, that you knew Michael's knowledge of it would destroy everything you had worked for." Elizabeth's hands trembled at her sides, her eyes darting from Poirot to her mother. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Poirot smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "I believe it is time to reveal the final piece of this puzzle, mademoiselle. You see, your mother, Cynthia, was not the woman you thought she was. She had been hiding something from Michael Radford, something that tied her to his past. And when he threatened to expose it, she did what any desperate person would do. She killed him. There was a long, heavy pause in the room. The only sound was the crackling of the fire in the hearth, the rest of the world silent as the truth settled in. Cynthia's face was now completely drained of color. Her hands clenched at her sides, and for the first time, Poirot saw a flicker of true fear in her eyes. "Cynthia," Poirot said softly, his voice almost tender. "You wanted to protect your secret, and in doing so, you destroyed everything. You killed the man who was closest to you, the man who had known you better than anyone else. And you thought you could cover it up, hide it behind lies. But lies, as I have always said, are fragile. And the truth, it cannot stay buried forever." The room was silent, the weight of Poirot's words pressing down on everyone. Elizabeth's face twisted with confusion, her hands trembling as she reached for her mother, her voice pleading. "Mother, is this true? Did you kill him?" Cynthia's composure cracked, and for a brief moment she seemed to age before Poirot's eyes. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes filled with guilt, regret, and fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. I never meant for it to go this far," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to kill him, but he was going to ruin everything. He was going to expose me, all of us. I couldn't let that happen." Poirot nodded slowly, his expression softening slightly. "You thought you could silence him, but you did not account for one thing. The truth is always louder than any lie, and eventually it will be heard." Cynthia lowered her gaze, defeated. There was no more hiding, no more deception. Poirot turned toward the door, his voice calm, but filled with finality. "It is over now. The truth has come to light, and there will be no more shadows to hide in." As Poirot left the room, his footsteps echoing softly on the wooden floors, he felt the weight of the case settle on his shoulders. The game had ended. The murderer had been revealed, and justice would take its course. But the cost of that justice, it was heavy. And as the door closed behind him, Poirot couldn't help but mutter to himself, a final thought lingering in his mind. Ah, but human nature, it never changes. Chapter 12. The Hidden Enemy. The storm had returned with a vengeance. The howling wind battered the windows, the rain now a relentless torrent that poured down in sheets, splattering against the glass with a maddening intensity. Inside the house, the air felt suffocating, thick with tension. Hercule Poirot stood alone in the study, his sharp eyes darting over the various papers spread out before him. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped, casting long shadows across the walls. But it was the shadow of doubt that seemed to linger in the room, ever present, ever menacing. Poirot's mind raced. The puzzle was nearly complete, the pieces falling into place one by one. But there was something that didn't add up. The killer had been revealed. Cynthia Radford, the woman who had been hiding in plain sight, pulling the strings from the shadows. But Poirot could feel it, the subtle shift in the air. There was more to this story, something deeper, something more dangerous. The door creaked open, and Elizabeth Hawthorne entered, her face drawn, her eyes wide, with the unmistakable look of fear. She had been at the center of the investigation all along, the woman who had seemed the most vulnerable, the most tragic of figures. But Poirot knew better. She had her secrets, as they all did. "You were right, Poirot," Elizabeth said softly, her voice trembling. There's something I didn't tell you. Poirot's gaze remained steady, his expression unreadable. Ah, mademoiselle, the truth has a way of revealing itself, but it is always in pieces. One truth leads to another, like dominoes falling in an intricate pattern. What is it that you have hidden from me? Elizabeth hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. She looked away, clearly struggling with the weight of what she was about to say. I didn't want to believe it, but now I see it. I see the truth. Cynthia, she didn't kill my father alone. Poirot's mind sharpened at her words. His thoughts whirred, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together faster now. What do you mean, mademoiselle? Elizabeth swallowed hard, her eyes darting around the room as if to make sure they were alone. There's someone else who has been pulling the strings all along, someone who has been manipulating everything, hiding in the shadows. Poirot stood perfectly still, his sharp gaze never leaving her face. Go on, he said softly, urging her to continue. Elizabeth took a deep breath, her voice steadying slightly. It's Victor. Victor Radford. Poirot's brow furrowed, but his expression remained calm. Victor, but he has confessed. He admitted his involvement, his guilt. Elizabeth shook her head, her face pale with realization. No, Poirot. He wasn't the one who killed my father. He was just the pawn, the one who was manipulated. It was someone else who made him think he was doing the right thing. Poirot's mind raced as he processed her words. A puppet, you say? He murmured. And who, mademoiselle, has been pulling the strings? Elizabeth looked around the room again, her voice barely above a whisper. Cynthia's sister, the one who no one ever talks about, the one who's been living in the shadows, watching everything unfold. Her name is Isabelle. Poirot's heart skipped a beat as the truth hit him. Isabelle Radford. He had heard the name once years ago in passing. She had been a ghost in the family's history, never mentioned, never acknowledged. But now, in this moment, her role in the entire scheme became clear. Isabelle had been the hidden enemy, the one orchestrating the entire affair from behind the scenes, the master manipulator, and Cynthia, with her perfect alibi, had been the perfect accomplice. The hidden enemy, Poirot murmured to himself, his mind already piecing together the final steps of the story. But why, mademoiselle? Why would Isabelle want to manipulate her sister? Why murder Michael Radford? Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears as she spoke, her voice trembling. It was for the money, for the inheritance, but also for something deeper, something more personal. Isabelle was in love with Michael. She had been all along, but he rejected her. He chose Cynthia. And when he started to change his will, to leave everything to her, everything she had worked for, everything she had wanted, it drove her mad. She wanted to destroy him, destroy everything he stood for. Poirot stood, motionless, his mind racing. It all made sense now. Isabelle had been the one pulling the strings, manipulating Victor, manipulating Cynthia. But there was something more, something deeper. And what of Victor? What role did he play in this twisted game? Elizabeth's face was filled with sorrow as she looked at the floor. Victor was an innocent pawn. He was made to believe that killing his father was the only way to secure his future. Isabelle played on his fears, his insecurities. She made him believe that he had no choice, that it was the only way he could have everything. Poirot's expression softened slightly, though his mind remained sharp. So, Victor was manipulated, coerced into a crime he did not commit. But who is truly guilty here, mademoiselle? Is it Isabelle for orchestrating the murder, or is it Cynthia for her involvement in the plot, or is it perhaps Victor, who allowed himself to be swayed by lies? Elizabeth's face crumpled as she answered softly, "They are all guilty, Poirot, but Isabelle, she is the one who has been hiding in the shadows all along. She is the true mastermind. She is the one who has caused all of this." Poirot nodded slowly, his gaze narrowing as he processed this new revelation. It all made sense now. The strings had been pulled from behind the scenes, and Isabelle Radford had been the one who had orchestrated everything. She had used her sister and nephew as pawns, manipulating them into committing murder for her own personal gain. And now, as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Poirot knew that the final confrontation was inevitable. "There is one thing left to do," Poirot said, his voice quiet but firm. "We must find Isabelle. We must expose her for the manipulator she is and bring her to justice." Elizabeth nodded, her face filled with a mixture of relief and fear. "But how, Poirot? She's gone. She disappeared years ago. No one knows where she went." Poirot's gaze was sharp, his mind already working on the next move. "Ah, mademoiselle, you forget one important thing. The truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how well it is hidden. Isabelle cannot escape the consequences of her actions. She will be found." As Poirot turned toward the door, his mind already racing through the possibilities, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to this story, more that had yet to be uncovered. Isabelle Radford may have been the hidden enemy, the one pulling the strings, but who else had been complicit in the crime? What other secrets were lurking in the shadows, waiting to be exposed? But Poirot knew one thing for certain. The final chapter of this mystery was not yet written. Isabelle Radford would be found, and the truth would be revealed. But at what cost? "The game is almost over," Poirot murmured to himself, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. But human nature, it never changes. And in the end, it is always the truth that prevails. As he stepped into the storm, the sound of the wind howling around him, Poirot knew that the final showdown was near. The hidden enemy would soon be unmasked, and the consequences of their actions would be felt by all. But in that moment, Poirot could not help but wonder, had he truly uncovered everything, or was there more to this tangled web of deceit than even he could see? Only time would tell.